Hey everybody, tonight we're debating capitalism versus socialism, and we are starting right now. With our capitalist side going first with their introductions. Thanks so much for being here, Steve and SOD. The floor is all yours.
And thank you, James, and for Stephen and Leo for joining us for this debate tonight, and for Josh for setting up the debate as well. Looking forward to a robust debate on the merits of these economic systems. There is no question in my mind that capitalism as an economic system is the greatest guarantor of individual human freedom. I will not, however, make the statement up front that capitalism requires democracy, nor will I say that socialism is synonymous with totalitarianism. What I will propose is that capitalism is the most moral, just, and direct conduit to individual human freedom. We're going to define capitalism as follows: an economic system in which production and property is privately owned and labor is exchanged through private interactions between individuals through voluntary association. As I understand the socialist view of economics, and I know this critique varies between socialists, is that the poor and the lower class do not have the freedom to create those voluntary associations. They must participate in a system which is inherently unequal and therefore are exploited by capitalists, such as the shop owner, the shareholder, or the Wall Street investor, that unfairly benefits from the fruits of their labor. There are many across the spectrum, from laissez-faire libertarians all the way to your staunchest Marxists, that have negative views of those that leech off the fruits of the labors of others. Though everyone seems to disagree as to who those leeches are. On the left, it is typically seen as the wealthy capitalist that doesn't work on the GM production line, the Amazon fulfillment center, or the Tyson slaughterhouse. Those on the right look to those that can productively work and choose not to, that exploit social welfare programs and don't contribute to the market system in productive ways when they ought to. It is my contention that if capitalism is naturally exploitive, socialism is intentionally exploitive. It is designed to extract wealth, capital, and labor from individuals to distribute it for broader social good. I'm sure our interlocutors believe that this can be done through purely democratic means and in a just and equitable way. My contention is that the controls that would be needed to make this occur would be baked into a system that would ultimately be corruptible and prone to inefficiency and could create the same inequality that they propose to rectify through socialism. I'm going to keep things short on my part tonight so we can get into the meat of things. But what I'd like to know is how their specific brand of socialism is to function without the necessary mechanism of government corrosion, which I see as necessary for such a system to exist. How is freedom of association still maintained if you must participate in a system, in a workplace such as socialism, whether or not that workplace would be democratic? How is labor supposed to be compensated for if wage is no longer the form of compensation? How do you expect such a system to actually function in the real world without top-down government control? With that, I'll yield my time to Spencer.
Should I get going, or should I just start? Okay. Sorry, this is my first rodeo. So the degree to which an economy thrives or falters can arguably be summed up in not simply the degree of material or human capital it has, but the degree to which systems in place allow that capital to dynamically respond to change and organize themselves. To facilitate this, that system must minimize and signal costs, so not just direct material or transaction costs, but the oft overlooked agency cost. Agency costs are essentially the costs incurred when an agent, given powers on behalf of the principal, an organization, person, or group of persons, acts in divergence with the interests of the principal. These manifest particularly between management and stakeholders, and voters and politicians. Agency costs, I would submit, are the single largest reason why socialism does not perform as well as capitalism, be it in the form of worker socialism, social democracy, or state socialism. Those interests diverge much more greatly with them, as it takes more coordination, information, or negotiation to align those interests. We see this with voters being more satisfied by their local politicians than the ones at the federal level, as now you have larger voter pools and more competing interests. We see it in traditional corporations where the more managers you have, I have 9 bosses vis-a-vis office space, the less productive employees are, either through micromanagement or having managers with different knowledge levels and performance markers, directing employees under them. In either case, worker ownership invites more managers, or at least more owners who would be selecting them. The latter doesn't always happen, of course. We see examples of agricultural cooperatives functioning well, and indeed most of the largest cooperatives, at least in the US, are primarily agricultural. That is because they involve fewer people, and the knowledge level and interests among worker owners are more or less the same. If you were to take a large industrial conglomerate where aerospace engineers, marketing directors, and welders all were trying to evaluate whether someone is sufficiently productive at their job, there'd be a great deal of miscalculation involved. Nonetheless, the fact that cooperatives do not always fail is not the same thing as them performing better. Indeed, cooperatives fail to be competitive at scale without bringing in outside investors, rendering them increasingly less like a cooperative. Corporations reduce this agency cost of management by having stockholders appoint directors whose full-time job is just to run the company, along with them appointing managers as needed. One can argue co-ops can select their directors too, but those directors are now answerable to all of the employees whose interests may not be in line with the long-term health of the company. Corporations have lower agency costs when stockholders select their director and fire them for underperforming because they're selecting someone whose job is to further their interests. One argument for co-ops is that it is more fair or more moral, often invoked with the refrain of democratizing the workplace, as the workers are the ones producing the wealth. Agency costs notwithstanding, this often comes with the implication that such firms should be restructured into co-ops by law, which, if that is a recommendation here, it flies in the face of individual workers' rights and the concept of democracy. Some workers do not want to be an owner, which comes with more responsibility as well as more risk, since now one can lose their life savings in the stock of the company they work for should it fail. The risk-adverse nature of workers informs of why most don't start their own businesses, as well as why agency costs are higher for cooperatives. This is all before considering that isn't it just the workers producing wealth, but the material capital of the capitalists that make those workers be able to produce that much more wealth. And it was the capitalists that took on the risk in doing so, which further renders the idea of the wealth producer being the legitimate owner not one consistently applied. Now, many advocates of cooperatives point to the success of Mondragon in the Basque Country of Spain, but tend to overlook that it is a federated cooperative, making it more like a conglomerate, many of whose largest members have outside investors, making them less like cooperatives themselves. And Spain's corporate tax structure favors cooperatives, with lower tax rates for co-ops, and especially for specially productive co-ops. Some even point how Mondragon fared better through various Spanish financial downturns, but again, this overlooks that one of the largest members of Mondragon is Spain's third largest credit union, Laboral Cuxta, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, which gives preferential loans to its co-op members, but was still had to be bailed out by the Bank of Spain in 1986. Mondragon appears to succeed to a greater degree than other co-ops by behaving the least like a co-op and arguably more like a conglomerate with an ESOP program, along with receiving special treatments by the government. But what about nationalized systems like the post office or healthcare or fire departments? Well, it turns out that, at least for the US post office, it has been mounting unfunded liabilities since the 60s when its workers strike to be able to form a union, restructuring the post office to be funded by postal services primarily instead of the government, but given a huge line of credit when it posts losses. Besides, several developed countries have already privatized their postal services. Private fire departments are rare but do exist, and they do perform more efficiently than many public ones, and do so on a municipal contract, despite the common association with such services being provided only to the individual clients who pay their dues. Healthcare is another one. People often claim that the reason the U.S. healthcare system is broken, which it is, because it is profit. Sure. Is anybody else hearing it? Because it might just be me, my voice breaking as I'm running out of breath or whatever. I didn't hear it. Did anybody else?
My mic's been muted, so I don't think it's coming from me. But if it's been happening, I haven't been paying attention. I'm sorry.
Oh, you know what it might be? Maybe I'm unconsciously clicking my pen without realizing it. All right, where was I? So because the healthcare system is profit driven, but this ignores that less than 5% of U.S. healthcare spending is profit, with less than 0.5% being via insurance. It also ignores the Singaporean system, which performs on par, if not better, than the least costly single-payer system in Korea, all while being more privately funded than even the U.S. A simple critical examination of just single-payer countries themselves shows a huge amount of variability among single-payer systems and costs, which tells us there are non-trivial factors other than the presence or absence of single-payer, and there isn't even a strong relationship between the degree to which healthcare is publicly funded and a difference in costs. Claims that these systems are more efficient because they're more socialized or nationalized almost always relies on ignoring any other potential factor in its degree of impact. At the end of the day, when advocating for nationalization of anything, we must recognize the state for what it is, sanctioned violence. Now, violence can be justified under certain circumstances, but only to the extent to which it is necessary. If you can achieve your goals with less violence or without violence, then I think we can all agree that's a morally superior method. Some methods are necessary with the state, but even in the existence, albeit rare frequency, of natural monopolies or even public goods are not themselves proof of the state having to necessarily provide them, let alone the state provide any other things. Ultimately, I would argue the advocacy of socialism in one form or another is one that is based on sincere good intentions as well as expediency, which are often the means by which ideas take hold and thrive in politics. However, politics is an arena where ideas do not need to work or even be tested to survive. So socialism requires a more robust argument. And with that, I'm done.
Thank you very much for that opening statement, and we will now kick it over to our socialism team. Want to let you know, folks, if it's your first time here, consider hitting that subscribe button, as we have many more juicy debates coming up. And want to let you know, whether you were listening via YouTube or to Modern Day Debate on podcast, we have got our guests linked in the description. We highly encourage you to check out their links so you can read or hear more from each of our guests. And with that, we'll kick it over to Cyber and Port as well as Leo as they make their case for socialism. Thanks so much for being here, guys.
Yeah, it's kind of weird that Leo left just to see it. Like, that's just okay. I'm defending this on my own, I guess. So it was something that kind of came up in the last debate that myself and Leo did on this very topic. It was a little bit of a point of contention, although it was mainly Leo that kind of said it. I'm going to kind of take that mantle tonight. So the point of contention is that Leo stated that there has not been a socialist country. There's not been a country that has operated under socialism. I agree with this statement. If you can find me a country that is both operating as a social democracy, more akin to your Norway, Denmark, Sweden, they're they're very robust and very secure social safety net and social protections, as well as every single institution, organization, business, like anything that you can think of where there is a hierarchy involved. So someone from the bottom to the very, very top and everybody in between, where they have been put in those positions through the democratic process, thereby a worker co-op. Unless you can point to me a system or a country where every single aspect of that country has been elected through the democratic process and has the benefits of what we call a social democracy, or very robust and very expanded social safety nets, kind of hasn't been a socialist country. There've been some that have gotten maybe parts. There's been statists, or a country operating under statism. There are countries in the world that expedite pieces of this. I'd mentioned Norway, Denmark, Sweden, which would be more of a social democracy. There are worker co-ops in quite a lot of countries all over the world. That doesn't make them socialist. Simply because a country has socialized medicine does not mean that the country is operating under socialism. It just means that one aspect is socialized. So yeah, I didn't really have kind of much else to say. I had said it was going to be a quick opening, so I'll leave it over to Leo.
I just had to whet my whistle there before I get going here. So the debate between socialism and capitalism is, to me, always been an interesting debate to be had. It's a discourse that's always interested me, and as almost boastful as it might sound, it interests me because at some level it surprises me to see so many people defending a system that fundamentally rests on exploitation in some sense or another. What exactly is socialism? there's been many people with many different definitions and ideas of what socialism either is or should be throughout history. And I think that a lot of the traditional examples that we often see of what socialism is or how socialism could be construed, I mean, think of your Stalin, your Lenin, your Mao Zedong, your Pol Pot. I personally, I think there is a debate to be had on whether or not the systems and the ideologies they advocated for really enshrine a lot of the strictures of what Marxism fundamentally is. I'm willing to concede, for at least the sake of this discussion, that they represented it at least in some form. That being said, I think things like Marxism, Leninism, things like Stalinism, things like Maoism are fundamentally tangential to the discussion that we're having. Socialism, as I would define it, is the socioeconomic ideology in which the means of production, distribution, and exchange are socially owned and democratically controlled by the working class. At least technically speaking, that's how I would define socialism. For people who might not necessarily be as acquainted with certain sociological and economic terminology, socialism is generally construed as having two parts. The first one is essentially a democratization of the economy by the workers. And the second one would be something along the lines of decommodification. Now, as Stephen has already pointed out, no country has ever really been socialist. Now, it is true that many nations have encapsulated certain ideas such as demodification of particular markets. Healthcare and transportation are two very, very prominent ones that we would see in most Western democracies, and also worker cooperatives existing in the vast majority of countries that we see on the face of the planet. So the main problem that I have with capitalism, and I'm going to try to keep this as short as I can because I don't want to take up too much time, but I did want to start by saying I don't view capitalism as a system that was created with the intent of being abusive or extractive. I think that the system has just been utilized to do that because it can so easily return a massive profit to a few amount of people by utilizing the system in such a way, in an abusive and extractive way. So I don't see capitalism as being an intrinsically evil or destructive ideology. I don't think that was what it was intended to do. I just think that is what it is currently used for, and I don't think that the system is capable of reform. I view capitalism as being fundamentally autocratic, which might sound almost hyperbolic at first, but I think that there's a strong case to be made for that in the fact that workers don't have any control over what a company that they work at does. All of the power of what a company is and what a company will do, what its vision is, who gets hired, who doesn't, who's going to be a manager, all of that these are decisions that are made by a very, very select few number of individuals. I think that democratizing the workplace and ensuring that everybody who is employed by a firm across our entire economy, not just selectively, would ensure a greater workplace happiness and greater content with life. Now, there is empirical data demonstrating the success that worker cooperatives have all across the world, from the fact that they can absorb price shocks and economic shocks as well as economic downturns just as well, oftentimes better than traditional firms can, to the fact that workplace happiness and wages are oftentimes generally significantly higher, to the fact that they oftentimes survive the first 3 to 5 years of business much better than traditional firms do. We can look at all of this data and see that worker cooperatives are in fact a successful means of governing our economy. And I think that it's not just something we should do, it's necessary to transition our economy in that direction. Now, what about decommodification? What decommodification means, there's essentially two senses in which it can be construed. We can decommodify labor, which means that labor does not exist as a commodity to be sold for a wage within a market structure. And that would be decommodification of labor, or we can look at decommodification in the terms of structuring our markets and the products and services that are provided through them as not being traded for the sake of profit, as being provided to people for the sake of allowing or affording people the products and the services requisite to a substantive standard of living. And like I said earlier, I think that some countries, most countries, have adapted some of these practices, but I don't think any country has adapted all of them. And I would argue that's what a socialist country is. And I would argue that's what a socialist country needs to be for me to say that it is socialist, at least as Marx and Engels originally laid out. And I would argue that it is not just something that could be done, that it is an imperative that humans move in this direction if we are to ensure a sustainable, bright, and progressive future for ourselves and our posterity.
Thank you very much, Leo and Cider and Port, for that opening statement. Very excited. We're going to jump into the open conversation, folks. And with that, gentlemen, the floor is all yours for open conversation. Oh,
So
I
I
think
suppose
SOD, you're on mute.
That's right. I just realized that I'd like to start out. We could talk about something that Leo brought up, how workers have no power when they aren't owners. I don't necessarily disagree with that, but is that necessarily a problem since the consumers still have power? And while everyone's a consumer and not everyone's a worker. So if you have a proper signaling of the conditions of the workplace, and if people are intolerant to poor working conditions, be it wages, benefits, or just improper hours, the consumers can decide to boycott them. So is that necessarily it?
I would agree to an extent, at least, with pretty much everything that you said. But one thing that I would choose to elucidate on is the fact that consumers do have power, and in certain respects, I would agree that they have more power than a laborer does in our markets. But I would argue that consumers generally only have power, or at least power that they can express through what's often called a term that you are familiar with, in saying that you are familiar with purchasing power. But I would also argue that purchasing power can be affected by the structure of markets and can be affected by forces acting within that market that don't necessarily stem from the consumer. And I think that this is very, very prominent in markets that would be inelastic, such as I would argue healthcare, where the price curves, I think is what they're called, the supply demand curves, don't change relative to they're inelastic. That demand for a product doesn't change its value. It's always going to be worth something. Those are people rather are always going to pay something for that, like healthcare, because it's one of those things people need to survive. So I would argue that consumers do have more power than labor.
Leo cut out for me.
Would be.
Yep. It's the end of your sentence there, Leo, was robot, you cut out.
What's up?
The end of your last sentence was kind of robot. Yep.
Am I back? Okay. Sure. I have no idea what was going on. You guys can hear me, right?
You cut out just a moment ago.
Okay. Give me a second here. There we go. What? So where did I cut out at?
Around talking about the inelasticity of healthcare. Is that right? Is where you started to garble out.
Oh, so what I was bringing up inelastic markets as an example, that while consumers do have power in the markets, that their power doesn't extend to the level that of the capitalists, the industry owners would. And also, while we can boycott companies we feel are performing poorly, that is a very nuanced subject, mainly because of what I would argue is monopolization, which I think is something inherent to capitalist systems, whereby there are only certain firms where we can go to receive some products. So even if they engage in behaviors we would otherwise disagree, we don't have anywhere else to receive these products or services that are requisite to us living our lives. So we can't just say, hey, I'm not going to buy a product from you anymore because you're the only place I can get this product from. On top of that, I don't think that boycotts generally have worked. I think that
You lost them again.
I think what we might want to do, just until Leo's internet catches up, is maybe kick it over to Cider and Port to give a response. Leo, I hate to do that, but just because your internet is wobbly, and so we were kind of losing what you were saying there again, and so maybe we'll give you just a bit of time to hopefully it stabilizes.
It's also possible that if he just turned off his camera, and it might help if it's just a bandwidth issue.
Yeah, it might just help for the bandwidth.
That's a great idea.
So Josh,
Back.
kind of.
Basically,
Kinda.
Leo, I think your connection is behind and choppy, and so I was just saying to Cider Import, maybe he should talk for a while, just
Mhm.
until your connection can hopefully stabilize, because we couldn't hear a lot of what you were saying, and if
That's
you
fine.
repeat it again,
That's
we
fine.
probably won't hear it again.
That's fine.
Yeah, so Josh, there was a few things there that I kind of took down during your opening, which was you had said that there was like this difference between politicians at the state level and politicians in like Congress and the Senate, et cetera, et cetera. And that, you know, that like these state politicians kind of tend to represent the people better. It's kind of ironic though that the root of the problem there is capitalism. It's
How so?
because of, well, I mean, it's because of lobbyists. It's because of you know, like massive corporations that are donating X amounts of hundreds of thousands at a time to a given politician, so that they get elected, and then that they go into Congress and the Senate, and they are in a position to be able to write and draft legislation that directly benefits them, benefits the corporations.
To speak on that, Stephen, you don't think that would be a problem in a socialist society where industry does have influence? I mean,
No.
especially if you're specifically thinking small or larger scale industries
I don't.
being singular. Why do you
I mean,
think that would be different? I mean,
well,
they're going to
because-
still have interest in benefits and some kind of incentive to have politicians either agree with their society or their specific industry over another industry, and unless you're considering even having some kind of market competition within those co-op systems, there's going to even be more of a pressure for those individual co-op systems, maybe not influenced specifically through money, but through favors or incentives to influence specific politicians, and politicians influence specific industries. There's still going to be the same problem. It's just going to be a different problem.
Not only that, but even today, unions they lobby a ton. In fact, among super PAC dollars, unions contribute to super PACs more than corporations do.
Yeah. Okay. So
Yeah, I honestly
kind
don't
of-
see that as a negative.
Well, I think corruption is a negative, whether it's from corporations or unions. I think the issue there, which I think is a problem, is that you have much more concentrated regulatory power. Which, when you have more regulatory power, you increase the incentive to capture it. When it's more concentrated, it's more easily captured. If you reduce or diffuse that power, and there's many ways you can go about doing that, you either reduce the incentive to capture it, or if it still is captured, less damage can be done in doing so. I think lobbying is a symptom of the deeper problem, and it's not really the cause of it. And the problem is the state intervening too much in markets, whether they be socialist or capitalistic markets.
Yeah, so I would just kind of have to say that I would respectively disagree with what Steve said. So we know that candidates for Congress and for the Senate can get elected purely through a grassroots effort. I mean, you look at any of the squad, any of the Justice Democrats that are in. I think Richard Ojeda in North Carolina came like ridiculous. He didn't actually get in, but he came ridiculously close. Like that is like a purely like to the heart red state. And he came, I think it was in 2 or 3 points, and he's a Justice Democrat. And like these people can get, so, you know, as I said, members of the squad, you have Ro Khanna, who is in the Senate, of course, Bernie Sanders. All of these types of characters can get in purely on small dollar donations, and with no need of a super PAC or any sort of a major corporation that are getting in.
I think it should be noted that, like, I know at least for AOC, she was recruited by Zach Exley, who is with the Justice Democrats, and they're funded in part by Soros. So it's not really entirely grassroots. It certainly is partially that, and definitely tries to hold this air of grassrootsing. But it's very much that you get a lot of plausible deniability from the appearance of grassroots, whatever to the extent you actually are.
Wouldn't that be more due to the fact that anybody can donate to the Justice Democrats and George Soros donates? I mean, obviously, he's got significantly more wealth at his disposal, so he can donate significantly more than the average person can. But I think that there's a difference between somebody who's really rich providing a donation, even maybe a generous donation to, and not even necessarily a political campaign, to any sort of organization, and actively funneling tens, if not hundreds of millions into a super PAC designed to elect particular candidates that hold to particular ideologies that would benefit the very people who are funneling money into their campaigns. Now, you had mentioned earlier that unions do that. What I wanted to say is that they're supposed to. Their job is to lobby on behalf of the workers. And I would argue that organizations lobbying our government, as well as our, at least currently, capitalist economic system, and the people that sit at the top of it, lobbying them to ensure that they have some decent standard of living, I don't think is a bad thing. And I think it's drastically different than massive industries like the fossil fuel industry collectively pooling hundreds of millions of dollars into organizations that then distribute that money to politicians to protect the interests of the oil industry, which, as we've seen and see today, come at a detriment to not just ourselves now and our environment, but our future societies, because they'll have to deal with these problems.
At the same, I don't disagree that absolutely happens, and that in basically corrupting the process that has happened with fossil fuels. But we also see it with environmentalists who successfully lobbied to essentially gut nuclear in the 80s, which then helped keep fossil fuels in place for decades. And ironically enough, much of the propaganda that was pushed out was made by fossil fuel companies. So it doesn't really matter. I don't think it matters who it's coming from. The problem is that we've concentrated too much power, and then the stakes increase, and then everybody's just in this huge bidding war for it, and you have all this rent seeking, and that's the problem. And unions are no more virtuous than corporations, in my opinion. I don't have any problem with unions in principle, although I do have a problem with, like, public sector unions are an issue because they have an adversarial relationship with the taxpayer. But unions in principle aren't necessarily bad, but they also aren't any more virtuous than corporations either, because they consist of human beings and they are just as subject to corruption as anything else.
They're lobbying for their interests is just the same as union workers and Greenpeace or the NRA or any single entity that has some private interest. And many times we look at those kinds of organizations and say, well, that's on the other side and I don't agree with it, so they must be some kind of negative. Well, that money doesn't come from nowhere. I mean, there's people that donate to those organizations to provide that interest into the governmental system. Now, I would personally not mind having lobbying completely removed from the system. I mean, that would be, that would solve a lot of problems across the board.
It's largely unenforceable, unfortunately. And
exactly.
Really, what you have to do is you have to reduce the incentive for regulatory capture. And a lot of people are kind of iffy on reducing regulatory power, but you can certainly diffuse it. You can increase the number of legislators per capita. You can have more local governance, where having to secure the loyalty of a particular candidate to your ideology or your specific policies, it doesn't go as far because that vote is diluted. And if you have term limits, it's even further diluted. That's what we kind of see in parliamentary systems. There's a lot more turnover because if you don't form a coalition, you have another election, and there's far more legislators per capita as well. So I think that's why we see, because even in Finland doesn't have any restrictions on campaign funding or contribution in terms of total amount that you can have, much like the US, but we don't see the same level of corruption. They have more local governance in particular. So the issue, I think, is we have far too much concentrated power. And then interested groups, and everyone's interest has their own interests, are now lobbying to get that, because if they don't secure loyalty, then somebody else will, and then it's going to be to their detriment.
So I did want to jump in here really quickly to touch on a point that both Steve and Josh brought up. I agree that numerous different organizations with numerous different special interests donate to political campaigns and other non-political groups and what have you. But the point that I think, the larger point anyway, that I think that needs to be discussed is what the interests of those organizations are. If an organization is donating to our government and lobbying our government on behalf of worker protection regulations, higher wages, better benefits, things like that, while that is lobbying the government, I don't see that as a negative. But if an industry is lobbying on behalf of the protection of their profits, deregulation of their industry and their businesses so that they can funnel more money into the pockets of shareholders and executives, things like that, while that is lobbying, that comes with negatives that you would not see from organizations lobbying on behalf of a collective of people, because I think that better represents what it is that people want, rather than you having industries lobbying our government to protect their power.
I think I don't fully disagree. I don't fully agree. So I think it's important to recognize that when unions lobby, they don't lobby on behalf of workers. They lobby on behalf of their own members, even if this means to the detriment of workers outside of that union. A classic example is when
I could agree with that, but I do think it's nuanced.
Well, a classic example, which is short, like during Reconstruction, maybe shortly after, while racist white unions in the South lobbied for prevailing minimum wages, knowing to prevent newly freed black slaves to underbid white union construction. And
unions did that frequently throughout the 30s, the 40s, and the 50s, but African Americans weren't afforded. I would argue that, as wrong as it was more a product of the way that society was back then. Had African Americans been afforded the same rights, I think they would have had, or rather enjoyed, the same protections from those unions. And I do agree with what you're saying, but I do think it is a little bit more nuanced. I don't think that we can just blanket statement unions. What they lobby for might help some people, but it can come to the detriment of workers oftentimes. I do think that is the case with, like, say, the NEA, the National Education. I think they're a bad one. Police unions. Yep. So I do agree with you, but I do think that there is nuance there in which unions we're talking about. I think some,
absolutely,
for the most part, do some good. But
you don't think this would be an issue within a socialist system? That there would be competing
special interests,
that there'd be competing interest groups within that system.
Well, yes, but I would argue that because the structure of market firms would be oriented around the worker, and that things such as what particular political campaigns, if this is even something they're capable of doing, any particular firm would contribute to, would be something that the workers of those firms would collectively vote on, which seems to me that what you would find is that there would be some lobbying of the government, but it would be a collectives of people lobbying the government on behalf of protocols or policy that is likely to largely benefit the worker cooperatives and the people who are a part of them. Now, obviously, worker cooperatives aren't as expansive or thorough throughout our societies to know whether or not that's what they would do. But I feel that seems to be a cogent argument that could be made.
Well, I would want, like, so we saw a little bit of this in the 30s, where, when unionization increased, and many of the things that were formalized in the 1938 Fair Labor Standards Act had already become industry standards, largely because unions had gotten it that way. So when unions collectively organize through voluntary organization and bargaining to achieve those kind of results, that is a market mechanism that doesn't really create these negatives that often come from lobbying, which is why I would prefer personally. I think the Fair Labor and Standards Act was just a formality for the most part. Much of that was already kind of industry standard. And so,
I just wanted to add in really quickly, this is why I advocate for syndicalism rather than the government stepping in, though I think that when all other methods have failed and the government is the only thing that we can turn to step in, then we should do so. But yeah, I agree with what you're saying so far.
Yeah. So, as I touched on in my opening, is that if you can achieve your desired results without using the state or some form of aggressive violence, then that's the better method. Even if you can get better results from the state, like, this is the extreme version I use of this only because it's not as an example, but for perspective, is if tomorrow we had incontrovertible proof that we could cure cancer if we enslaved a random 5% of the population, that it still would be wrong. So we shouldn't do it.
Mhm.
So there are certain thresholds that we find morally intolerable. So we should always look for the least violent solution. And if we can achieve that through market mechanisms, and unions through collective bargaining is certainly one of them, I don't think we should. And I didn't want to presume this was the recommendation on your part, whether you wanted to force firms to restructure into co-ops, or simply we should want to make it that way, or this is a great reason why it should be that way. I would definitely be object to forcing them to be. If workers and firms decide voluntarily to restructure themselves or form new ones, I have no problem with that, because co-ops aren't morally bad. Disallowing co-ops by law or forcing things to be co-ops by law, that's bad.
So yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. I think that we should use the least amount of authority that we can in implementing the systems we feel are best going to improve the material conditions of everybody that everybody in our civilization. I'm going to try to be brief here because I do want both Steve and Stephen to jump in here. But I would argue socialism does that. I would argue that market firms being structured around the worker and starting with at least selective decommodification would result in requiring less from the government in ensuring that markets are going to operate in a productive and a beneficial manner. And I would argue that the fact that we have had to rely on the state to regulate markets to ensure more equitable distribution of the resources that are gained from those markets amongst all of those who collectively contribute to their production, and ensuring the fair, equitable, and sustainable action of firms in the markets. The fact that we've had to rely on the government to ensure those, I think, is a testament to the failure of a capitalist system. I think a socialist system, a market socialist system in which you still have markets and there can still be things like competition and firms and everything, but having them democratically controlled, I think, would result in them operating in a way that is centered more around the worker, rather than around simply making a profit at whatever means necessary, which would result in less intervention from the government in the markets, as that would result in less corruption that we would see in the markets.
Well, I want to hit that point, but I do think we should let Steve hit. So I wrote a little note, and we can touch on that again.
Steve, I mean, what's your kind of general opinion on unions? Do you think that they can be corruptible? Are they just as bad as lobbyists, or what's the kind of story there?
I mean, it depends on it depends on the situation. I think pretty much anything can be corruptible. And when public sector unions, as we've already discussed, are a major issue, because they do have that relationship with the government already embedded in them. I mean, I'm not sure how familiar you are with the unions sector in Michigan and the United Auto Workers Union. They actually are not just for the auto workers. They also have unions within the public sector as well, cooperative unions across different industries, bleeding into actual governmental systems, which is just bizarre. When I found that out, it blew my mind. I had no idea that people that worked for the government were part of the United Auto Workers. So I think it's fine if a union is very specific to a workplace, to a specific industry. And I understand that crossplay is meant there to be greater collective bargaining against specific industries. So if one part of that union is having an issue, then they can call on their buddies on the other part of the union, and then they cross strike or walk out, do those kinds of things to ensure that they have greater collective power against whatever industry that they're shooting against, or wherever they feel that they're wronged. But again, in principle, unions are not specifically a bad thing. I mean, workers should have protections. I think that can be done through several ways. Unions are one. Laws have created. I've never been personally part of a union, but I've never felt exploited as a worker, as a wage earner. So I don't think that it's necessary to have an equitable workplace, but I do think that they are corruptible as well.
Okay. So, I mean, do you think that unions are going to better kind of impact the workers, or would it be kind of lobbyists who are going to help get a politician elected, that politician is then going to implement laws to help the workers? Which one do you think is going to do the most amount of good?
Well, I think specifically unions should not be interacting specifically with the government. If they are concerned about the workers themselves, they shouldn't be specifically
Really
funding
quickly,
campaigns. Yeah,
isn't that fundamentally, isn't that sort of opposite of what unions are designed to do? Aren't they designed to lobby on behalf of workers because workers are so underrepresented
with
within our
that
market?
should they be
worker's
doing that?
employer. They're supposed to negotiate with their employer.
Exactly.
And also if they're a federated cooperative, also with other, like, the upper management of that federation. Because
So what does a union do when a corporation does not comply and continues to engage in abusive or extractive tactics? Do they not have the right to lobby the government on behalf of the workers?
okay, well, I think maybe we might be falling into an equivocation trap. Do you mean, when you say lobby there, do you mean like, hey, government, they are literally like abusing us, come and investigate this? Or are you talking about, hey, we need to change the law kind of thing?
Or are you talking about
I
giving
think
them
it could
money?
be both. I think it could be both.
Well, what I mean is that I think any employee, or anyone who represents that employee, has a duty, or like to represent them as well as they can. So if they're actually being abused, there are rules in place to to prosecute and investigate that kind of abuse. But that's very different from saying we should lobby the government to change the law, which maybe the law does need to change, but I think they should be treated distinctively.
I would argue that the law does need to be changed. One of the main critiques that I have with capitalism is that it inherently requires some underclass of workers from which wealth is extracted to maintain the high standard of living of the capitalist industry owners, as we've seen since capitalism has been a thing that has existed. There's been a stark divide. It's often been described in Marxist theory as a divide between the bourgeois and the proletariat.
Well, so it's important to remember that before capitalism happened, there was a lot more poor people, and
I agree.
And so capitalism has been, on net at least, a good in reducing poverty. In fact, it was actually one statistic.
I agree to an extent, yeah.
One statistic I remember for the Industrial Revolution was, ironically enough, the number of people who were poor seemed to go up. But that was because the people who were so poor that they were literally dying of starvation or exposure, they were living long enough to actually be counted among the poor, even though they still struggled to get by. So it's capitalism, or nothing is a light switch, and it takes time to build those resources.
Very true.
And so when you talk about extracting wealth, I think that that definitely needs something that we should probably unpack.
Okay. And I have no problem unpacking that and talking about that. But I did want to say really quickly that, and this is where I get into it with other leftists online, because at least I would argue, and obviously there's going to be those that disagree, that I understand what capitalism is as a system and it's sort of the history that it has, though I'm not by any means claiming to be an expert. But capitalism is a better system than feudalism, than chattel slavery and monarchism that we've had prior. I don't like I said in my intro, I don't view capitalism as a system that was designed as a way of we're all going to get rich and they're going to suffer. It wasn't this evil thing that these people sat around. It was saying, hey, you know what? We think that more people should be allowed to involve themselves and trade in the markets and create products and services and have the ability to trade them freely and make a living. And I think that that's a very good thing. And I do think that, at least when measured against systems like feudalism and monarchism, capitalism as an economic system versus those and many others like mercantilism is better. It provides for a little bit more freedom than those systems do. The argument that I would make is that capitalism has been utilized as a method for extracting wealth from an underclass of workers who provide their labor to generate that wealth, though they don't share in an equitable amount of the wealth that their labor produces. And that because of that, I would argue that capitalism is a system that humans have transcended, that capitalism, I'm not going to sit here and say it's this evil, terrible, bad system. It's just a system that I don't feel is capable of providing sufficient material conditions requisite to a substantive standard of living for for as many humans as we possibly can. And for anybody who would say, well, because I've had, and not that I'm ascribing this to anybody here, but I've had some people that I've had these discussions with say things along the lines of, well, capitalism does provide, sufficient material conditions for as many people as possible. And if that's the case, I would say that it does a pitiful job, because there are many, many more people that we could help. So the argument that I would make is not that capitalism is evil, but that it is a system. Yeah, it is a system that humans need to transcend because we've lived beyond its ability to provide for us as a society collectively. That's the argument that I would make.
At the risk of oversimplifying, you're saying that modern society has or can outgrow capitalism.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, I think before we to really try to address that, when you say equitable distribution or equitable amount of wealth extraction, what does that mean exactly in your mind?
For me, that would mean that the labor power or just the labor that somebody provides for the production of a good or a service, that they receive what would be a fair, I'm trying to think of the right words to use here, and it can be kind of hard to use to find them, a fair, I guess you could say, recompense. So I'm quite certain you know what this is. I would hold to Marx's labor theory of value, that I don't agree with it exactly as Marx laid out, because it is, I would argue, something that's nuanced. But
you're referring to from each according to their ability to each according to their need.
Well, I think that the labor theory of value plays into that, but I think that the labor theory of value itself is something separate from that is a part of that, where it says that the value of somebody's labor should be equal to what labor was put in, or rather the value of some good or service should be, and I would add, at least in part or in some sense, equal to the amounts or the requisite labor to producing that good or service. So when I say that somebody is receiving an equitable a wage, I guess you could say, for what they're doing, is that the wage they're receiving is, number one, always enough for them to have at least a comfortable. I'm not going to say it needs to be, that they can go out and buy a Gucci bag every month, but a comfortable standard of living, regardless of the society that they live in, but that is also measured against the labor that they provide, the contribution that they provide to society.
So the biggest problem with the labor theory of value is that it only looks at one side of the thing. So trade occurs at the intersection of supply and demand. The problem with the labor theory of value is that it fails to account for time preferences and marginal utility. And
I would agree with that. Yes,
Marx, to his credit, attempted to reconcile it, and he called it socially necessary labor. The problem is that basically turns it into the subjective theory of value and everything but name, where it's the problem is that not all labor is worth whatever threshold you pick, and then it's zero. Not every form of labor is worth that. Now you could try to structure your society where the only forms of labor that are sold are valuable above that threshold. That's possible, but ultimately you can't really guarantee that any form of labor sold is worth that specific minimum amount, because it depends on how much the people who are buying it are willing to pay for it, and also if it's the kind of labor that almost anybody can provide, your bargaining power is severely diminished. So that's part of the problem. But what was going to say? So ultimately, the value of anything, labor included, is not based solely on the demands of those selling it. That doesn't mean that that doesn't mean that we can't try to create a system that minimizes suffering. I don't disagree there, but I think a lot of progressive policies that are either socialism in name or socialism in intent tend to overlook the idea that instead of examining, let's increase wages, let's increase benefits, let's examine what is driving up the cost of living. And a lot of it is protectionism for housing, for NIMBYs at the local level, protectionism at the borders with import tariffs. I'm not going to say it's all of that, but much of that is and for education. I mean, one of the big reasons why at least higher education is so much more expensive is that it has been indiscriminately subsidized, where now you have all this guaranteed funding that colleges are competing for, among these people fresh out of high school. And okay, we're not going to increase teaching faculty or computer labs. They're going to make fancier dining halls or student centers or athletic facilities because they're competing to bring those students there to get those guaranteed dollars. Teaching faculty per student has not really changed ratio wise since the 60s, but administrative faculty has doubled, if not tripled.
Yes.
And the Federal Reserve did a study, and they found roughly for every dollar increased in tuition, federally backed grants and loans, tuition increased 66 cents, and there's a huge pass-through effect. So the problem is that when you artificially restrict or artificially subsidize something, that's just a recipe for the price increasing. That doesn't mean so I think the problem here is there's a very expedient way, like, okay, this is a problem. We want more people to afford this, so let's pay for it more, but without really kind of examining what that's going to lead to. And in the case of pass-through tuition, at first it didn't seem nothing at first, but then now tuition goes up a little. More people now need the loans, and then it goes up, and it's created a feedback loop. And like way back in the day, when people decided you could just work a summer job and afford your college throughout the most of the year, and that was mostly true, at least for state schools. That's when loans were much harder to get, the interest rates were higher, and the acceptance rates were lower. And that's really what we have in education. And in healthcare, I would argue that it's a combination of we're artificially restricting supply in all sorts of ways, and we're artificially increasing demand in ways that probably are not an effective use of dollars. We can definitely reform end-of-life care. I mean, people over 65 are consuming almost a third of all healthcare spending, and Medicare is only 20% of healthcare spending. So,
and we have an aging population.
The aging population, I actually did a regression model in college, trying to isolate what potential factors might be for healthcare. And I thought aging population might be one, like the percent of the population over 65. It actually wasn't as significant as I expected.
Wow.
And I also expected population density to be a factor, but it really wasn't. The ones that were the most significant factors were the single biggest one was median household income. Higher the income, more people are willing to spend on healthcare, and part of that is that you have a lot more quality of life kind of care, but it's also, you're willing to pay for more the earlier pharmaceuticals, and you're not going to wait for it to go generic. You just immediately get like this because it's already available. We also spend a lot more on testing. Like, we have a much higher cancer incidence rate, which was the second biggest factor, but we also are much more. We spend a lot more on testing. We catch cancer a lot more, and we treat it a lot more. So we have a more than above average cancer survival rate, but at a much higher cost. So there's definitely diminishing returns in how much, even when we're trying to, like, you're not just bilking people for premiums, but so healthcare in the U.S. is a broken ass system. I'm not going to say it's okay at all, but I really, when I looked at it, the thing that kind of led me to that was that looking just at single payer countries, Norway per capita PPP costs 2.5 times that of South Korea, even though it's also single payer. So there's clear factors other than single payer. And in Singapore, actually, let's see, I think I have a really cool chart that I made that if I can share my screen, that kind of highlights exactly why the discussion on healthcare isn't asking the right questions. Am I able to share my screen here?
Yes, ready for you.
Okay, let's see, right here. So that's coming up. So what this is it's a breakdown of public and private spending on healthcare per capita in dollars, and then from left to right is an increasing portion of total healthcare spending that is public. And what you kind of see is there really isn't a clear pattern. So what I don't think the issue is it needs to be more publicly funded. I think the issue is that we're not asking the right questions of what factors are really driving up the cost of healthcare. And the one thing that stuck out to me was South Korea is the cheapest single payer, and it has a tiered system and has high out-of-pocket costs. And so does Singapore. And Singapore isn't a single payer system, but it's basically the same cost as South Korea. It's like a tiered multi-payer system, kind of like the US, but it isn't the crazy town that is the US. And so that's why I don't think they're implementing single payer in the US with no other changes would necessarily actually save the cost of delivering care. it would shift who's paying that cost, but that's not really the same thing. And I think it's really easy. The single payer is very seductive because it's a simple concept. It's an easy political sell, and I'm not going to say the single payer is bad, because there's just as much as I would say there isn't strong evidence that it reduces cost. There's also not strong evidence that it increases cost. But at the same time, I've looked for a more thorough study because I mean, this was just my college project, and I looked at let me see, the factors that I looked at were median household income, costs that are out of pocket, fertility rate, percent over 65, doctors per capita, population density, and percent that was public. And most of them were pretty much like they had R-square values less than 1, except for median household income, age standard cancer incidence rate, and percent out of pocket. Percent out of pocket was actually negatively correlated. The higher the percent out of pocket, the lower the cost. And the US is actually below average. The average percent of costs that are out of pocket in the OECD is 16%. The US is 10. Only the UK and France are really lower than them. And the Nordic average is 20%, and then South Korea is 35, and Singapore is right there with 35. But Singapore is not in the OECD. I had to get World Bank data for that one.
One sec. We just had a request. Someone asking for the 2 Steves. In particular, if you guys want to weigh in, we want to give you a chance, Cider and Port, as well as Steve.
I'm
just as captivated at this point as probably the audience as well. So that's excellent presentation. I'm glad that I stayed away from healthcare because I'm not that well versed in it myself. I've got a little practical information on it.
No, so
but,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
No. One thing that I was curious about is the decommodification of labor. How is that supposed to be implemented? How are you looking at? Are you looking at just completely removing wages? And I don't think that's how you were putting it earlier. But I guess I'm confused as to what you mean by that and how you're thinking that you're going to be able to figure out what a single worker is worth in a specific industry and how you make that equitable across the system.
So that, holy God, there's a lot to respond to. So I'm going to try to. First, I'm going to start with that question. I don't think that decommodification of labor means that the labor doesn't have a value. I think what it means is that the value of labor isn't a commodity on the markets. It's not something that we trade on markets as a commodity. It's something that's sort of inherent to the fact that somebody is a worker. This allows them the freedom to work where they please or work in whatever way they please while still ensuring that they have the requisite material conditions to sustain their standard of living. I did really quickly want to respond, and I can certainly make this quick, to what Joshua said there. As it concerns the labor theory of value, the main contention that he had with it is actually essentially the same main contention that I have with it, which is why I've sort of coined it myself, though I don't have like any formalization of it. I've sort of said the modified labor theory of value, rather, because I think that Marx was onto something with the labor theory of value, but I don't think that he quite hit the nail on the head there. I think that there are other factors that determine the cost of a good or a service. The main point that I have with the labor theory of value is that the labor requisite to the production of a good or a service should play a major factor in the cost of that, though not necessarily the only factor that plays into the cost of that good or service, as well as that what the worker is receiving for the production of that good or that service is enough for them, again, to have a substantive standard of living. As it concerns what you brought up with healthcare, and I believe it was education was the other market you brought up, some of the problems you pointed out with these markets, especially with education, with the student loans issue that you were mentioning, I would actually agree that is a problem, that the cost goes up because more money is put into the student loan program. And so that it seems that universities are utilizing that as a means to capture more revenue by increasing their tuition so that they capture more revenue out of the student loan program. I would argue that this is a result of the fact that education alongside healthcare is an inelastic market, that the cost of the products and services provided by that industry or that market do not depend on the supply or the demand of them. People are willing to pay whatever they can for these things because they are, at least for the most part, requisite to a decent standard of living in the society that we have today. But you would also mention that you hadn't seen any evidence that that single payer healthcare seems to reduce the overall cost of healthcare. I do have a study that was published in annals.org, which shows that the US system that we have now compared to systems in Canada is actually significantly more expensive, and most of that is a result of overhead cost or the wages that are paid to executives and shareholders. There's also another one that I have here that's in journals.plos.org that shows the same thing, and it was a meta-analysis of 22 single-payer plans over the past 30 years, starting in, I believe it was 2018 or 2019, that showed that single-payer systems seem to reduce the overall cost of healthcare provided on a collective basis.
Well, so I don't disagree. Doctors in the U.S. are paid far more than in other countries, particularly, and we have a much higher ratio of specialists. I don't disagree there, and part of that is informed by the cost of higher education in the U.S. But with regards to administration costs, it's that one can definitely play some shenanigans when it comes to admin costs, because administrative efficiency isn't just percent of your budget, because well, in terms of dollars per capita, Medicare actually spends more in dollars per capita than private insurance. And it's not because, but it's important to remember that the percent of your budget that is admin isn't necessarily administrative efficiency. If you're a retail store and your wholesale costs double, but everything else stays the same, your administrative costs as a percent of your budget go down, but you didn't become administratively more efficient. And that's kind of what it can. I'm not saying necessarily that's the case here, but you can't just look at percent of the budgets as okay there. Plus, not only that, but with at least
I agree.
And with Medicare, I think it's important to recognize that not all the entire cost of administrating Medicare doesn't even fall entirely on the balance sheet for Medicare. Like, for example, collections. Medicare doesn't do collections; the IRS does. Legal, you're pretty limited on how you can sue Medicare, but the DOJ kind of helps you out a lot as well. And advertisement's kind of a weird one, because every time a politician talks about Medicare, that's free advertisement in a way. But there's also Medicare, because it's kind of isn't really, it doesn't administrate fraud as vigorously as private insurance. They have a much higher fraud rate. They have a fraud rate of about 9 to 10%, which is kind of enormous. Whereas for
yeah, that is true. It's a little outrageous.
A private insurance, it's about 4 to 5. And now I'm not going to say private insurance is just great and super magical, because there's all sorts of issues there. But my issue with a lot of comparison of single payer systems is it's very difficult to cross compare, because even what counts as admin, like how Canada administrates itself, is different than how Medicare or the US administrates itself. So it's difficult to compare apples to apples. But my point was really that I suddenly lost my train of thought, like the worst time. No, is that in trying to isolate those factors, we're not asking the right questions, really. So what is driving up the cost of healthcare? Are Americans consuming more healthcare? Is the cost of healthcare more? Are we more unhealthy? The U.S. has the highest obesity rate in the developed world. We also have one of the highest violent crime rates in the developed world. Even if healthcare costs the exact same as elsewhere, we still have more healthcare spending per capita. So how much of that is just that we are more unhealthy, we are more violent, there's more strain on the healthcare system. And if that healthcare system is artificially restrained, either from certificate of need laws or FDA restrictions on importing drugs, or even arguably onerous licensure laws which artificially restricts the number of doctors, or even just nursing practitioners, those little things can add up. And healthcare is a complicated thing. So I'm not going to say what the answer is. I just think I have an issue with saying, well, single payer will solve all of our problems. Well, I don't think that's a simple answer. At the very least, just simply switching out everything in the U.S., given the regulatory structure that we have, that's why I'm not really convinced single payer in the U.S. is necessarily better. Because if you look at a number of single payer implementations, I won't say all because I haven't looked at all of them, much that comes with it is also removing a lot of red tape that allows it to operate more efficiently. That red tape that held back the private sector. Now, some argue that, well, the government's more accountable, so we can get away with getting rid of this red tape. And maybe you agree or disagree, but that's something that I don't think can be overlooked.
Yeah, I think the red tape issue is something that we face here in the United States, especially with the Affordable Care Act. But I think it's more that the red tape is structured in a way that it actually ends up benefiting most of the insurance companies, and in turn is regulating rather, providing care to people. In terms of the all what it is that's driving up the cost of healthcare and what most of the cost of healthcare in the United States go to, at least as measured from Canada. And this goes to the same study that I cited that was published in the Annals of Internal Medicine. It's called Healthcare Administrative Costs in the United States and Canada 2017. So it's a measure of the United States versus only Canada. From the study, quote, of the 3.2 percentage point increase in administration's share of U.S. health expenditures since 1999, 2.4 percentage points was due to growth in private insurers' overhead, mostly because of high overhead in their Medicare and Medicaid managed care plans, which is one of the reasons why I argue that there needs to be reform in both the Medicare and Medicaid programs. I think that Republicans have sabotaged those. I think that they've regulated them and structured them in a way that allows the private sector to abuse them for the sake of a profit, which has reduced the overall efficiency of the operation of these programs.
If I remember correctly, I know that overall, so the overall profit margin of providers, that the average profit margin of providers who have Medicare or Medicaid patients to any degree is about 5 to 10%, which is average. But 70% of providers actually take a loss because some of them take on more Medicare and Medicaid patients. And the loss is often anywhere from 10 to 40% per procedure. But the issue, if you look at it, is that that Medicare...
Don't some insurers get loans or grants from the government, though, that cover a lot of Medicare or Medicaid patients?
That I don't know how, I don't know what extent, so I can't really say. But I do know that what was I going to say? Oh yeah, so Medicare, the organization has the information, because they poll providers, like, okay, what is the cost of providing this? Like just the cost of providing this procedure, the labs, the doctor, the hours and all that, and they have that data. They just choose not to reimburse at that level for a lot of procedures for a lot of providers. And one of the more interesting things I saw when I found this out is I looked at is that right around about 1967, 1968 is right around when healthcare cost growth decoupled from inflation growth, which is shortly after Medicare. Now, I don't remember exactly who was in control of Congress in offhand that time, so I can't. Maybe it was Republicans, maybe it was the Democrats.
What was the year again? You said 68?
67, 68.
68.
Yeah, it's 1965.
It was Democrats that
during the
60s.
So.
Well, I think that wasn't that Nixon?
Well,
I don't think he had the Congress though during that period.
When did Nixon come into office? Was that 64?
69, I believe it was.
It was a lot later.
Yeah, it was after.
It was LBJ. Okay, yeah.
Oh yeah. I completely forgot about
good about LBJ. Yeah, that's right. The Great Society, the 60s.
Yep.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
But
your phone isn't silent if you drop it on the floor.
I did want to say that I have very much enjoyed this healthcare discussion. I do have some more rebuttals that I'd like to make, but being honest, I do think it is a little bit tangential to the overall discussion that we're having. Plus, I would like both Steve and Steven to chime in here as well.
Yeah, so I was just going to ask you, Steve, like, what's your kind of idea or your opinion on like taxation? Like, do you go like into kind of more sort of crazy land and think that it's theft, or like, are you okay with some, or like, what's the?
No, taxation is necessary to maintain government, and we need government as a necessary evil. Unfortunately, I don't consider humanity to be able to govern itself without having some kind of overarching structures to ensure that we don't go around killing each other and doing anything that we really want to, preying on the weak and all that kind of thing. Do I think that we should have an equitable tax across the board? I think especially if we're looking at a socialist system as the end game, everybody should be contributing the exact same percentage amount. It should not vary. There should not be a progressive tax whatsoever.
You said under a socialist system?
the whole
Under a
idea
social
of
system specifically. Well, if everybody is earning the same amount and everybody's contributing and getting those same benefits.
Well, see, that's the thing. I don't
that's
think
not
that
socialism.
I don't think that a socialist system advocates that everybody earns the same. To me, socialism is just to me, socialism is just economic democracy. It's just the means of production being collectively controlled and collectively owned and democratically controlled by the workers.
By the workers, by the working class.
Yes.
So, which
but the idea of
Joe.
like a flat wage and a flat tax is that's kind of more so kind of found under like some kind of like communistic states or like in that kind of it. Either way, it's not what would be found under a socialist country, and it's not what me and Leo are advocating for.
True. Yes.
So it would be progressive tax in both your opinions then.
Yes.
My whole kind of like my very, very, very quick idea or like my very, very quick opinion on taxes is the more you earn, the more you pay. Simple as that.
Well, I mean, that's technically the way it would work with a flat tax.
That's true.
In a sense. Go ahead.
No, so now one of the biggest criticisms of a flat income tax is that it puts an undue burden on the lower income earners, which is absolutely true.
It does.
But what you could do is simply have where it only kicks in above a certain threshold.
So wait, hold, and just to understand what you're saying, you're saying that it would kick in that people under a certain annual income might not necessarily need to pay that tax, that it would kick in at a certain point.
So basically you only pay, let's say flat, this is just hypothetical, is a flat 15%, only everything above $80,000 a year or 100,000 or whatever. You just pick whatever. But so your tax revenue will be lower, although the overall average tax rate of the entire workforce is 15%. It's just that, but the thing is that the bottom 40% are net tax recipients. So it's not just like everybody. So it's really roughly in terms of income tax revenue, the top 50% pay like 95% of income taxes.
The thing, and this is another thing that is contentious between me and other leftists on the internet, is that the wealthy do actually pay a larger percentage of taxes. But I don't think that a majority of leftists like myself or Stephen here would necessarily disagree with that. I think that what we would disagree with is the idea that the wealthy are paying a fair portion of the income they earn in taxes when you compare the income they earn and the taxes they pay on that income to everybody below them, where we pay significantly more taxes relative to our total income as compared to people who make even $1 million a year. They're paying oftentimes several percentage points less on their total income in taxes than we are, which I don't think is fair.
Well, that does raise the important question. What is a fair tax or fair share, as the common refrain is? Because there's two ways to look at this. What's the fair tax rate? And then what is the fair portion of the total tax burden you're paying? If you look at the portion of the total tax burden that each quantile, decile, whatever is paying, the rich pay a larger portion of the total tax burden than their portion of the total AGI. And it actually is an increasing portion until you get to like the top 0.001%, and then it starts decreasing again. It's still a greater portion of total tax burden than their portion of total AGI, but so the real question is, do you want them paying a bigger portion of the total taxes, or you just want them to have less money? I mean,
well, it sounds bad, but I think that there's certainly an argument to be made when it's dug into. But I want them to just have less money. I don't think I genuinely do not believe that there is a way that you could justify one individual earning $40-something million a year. I don't think that one individual can contribute productively in such a way that they earn that much money. I think that they make that much money because they have the power to write their own paychecks.
But CEOs don't write their own paychecks. The stockholders pick the CEO.
It's a little nuanced, but the executives and the shareholders work very, very closely ensuring that a majority of the wealth generated by a firm funnels into their pockets.
Now you are partially correct in that a CEO can influence the stock price, and if more of their compensation is in stocks, then that's
stock options. Yeah.
But actually, I wanted to circle back to what we were discussing before. Is that, do you have a meaningful distinction between a worker co-op and like just a traditional corporation with an ESOP program.
Yes, I think that an ESOP, what is it, employee stock ownership program? Is that what it is?
That I believe
Stock option program, something like that.
It's stock ownership program
Okay.
or policy. Yeah.
Okay. From the, and I must admit that the research that I've done on the differences, while somewhat substantial, is not really all that thorough. But from what I have seen, is that ESOPs don't seem to provide the same level of control over how the firm operates, nor do they seem to contribute as much in the revenue back to the workers as a worker cooperative does, whereby an ESOP allows an employee to own stock in the company, which I'm not going to say is necessarily a bad thing, but they're rarely are they owning stock at a level that allows them any substantive say or word in how that firm is operated, whereas a worker cooperative would essentially guarantee that.
No, you're right in that. So there are worker owned, and like an ESOP program, you become a worker owner, but you don't become a worker manager. You don't necessarily have a significant voting stake in determining the executive board or even being eligible for it, kind of thing. It's just that I bring that up because there are because if you want them to have a bigger stake, but when you have more worker managers, like then you get kind of a little bit too much input and a little
really
too
quickly.
much.
Can I ask what you mean by worker manager, just so that I understand exactly what it is?
So either you're actually a manager yourself, or you're selecting managers and you're kind of overseeing. So it's probably a better term for it. But what I mean is like if you're an owner, you're an owner. But if you're a union, okay, we're gonna select our CEO, and then all the workers have an election, or the workers then vote. That would be kind of like, but only the workers. And it would be among the workers, because you don't bring in an outside one. That's probably what I would probably call a worker manager.
Oh,
but there's probably a better way to articulate that. And
yeah, I don't think that with a worker cooperative, while I do believe that managers and supervisors and executives would be voted on, I don't think that it would have to be reserved to people that are within the firm. I think that it would just be more a democratic process whereby certain people can say, hey, I'd like to take up this managerial, supervisory, or executive position. And all the people that are employed by this firm collectively have the ability to vote on who has submitted themselves and who they think is going to best encapsulate the vision that those individuals have for that company. And I think that it just, so like I said, and I keep bringing up the phrase, but I think it's the best way to summarize what both myself and Stephen believe in is economic democracy, a democratization of the workplace where our firms are controlled democratically, the same way that our governments are. And I know that there are a lot of objections that are brought to that, especially in terms of, you're forcing people to give up their businesses and what have you, and the government's forcing people to structure themselves this way. But we already pretty much force people to structure businesses within a certain manner as it is. There's only so many different structural forms you can take when you start a business. You can't go anything outside of that. And a lot of that, I would argue, is beneficial. It ensures a level of sustainability. It ensures a level of community with these corporations, although I think that it could definitely be increased, and a level of accountability and transparency, although again, I think that could be increased. But in short, no matter what system you have, you're going to have some level of authoritative structure which ensures the sustenance of that system. And in socialism, it would be no different. I personally wouldn't argue for the government mandating worker cooperatives right away. I would argue that the government and financial institutions, I personally believe the financial institution should be decommodified and run through the government, but that's a different discussion for a different day, should provide incentives for businesses to structure themselves as a worker cooperative. And then if that doesn't do enough to push a movement toward worker cooperatives, then I think that the government should step in, yes.
I would say that we should allow firms and people in general, because a corporation is a voluntary, or people voluntarily organize, collect their pool their resources to try to achieve something they couldn't on their own. Unions do it, HOAs do it, if only from
worker cooperatives do it.
Worker cooperatives do it, exactly. So I think we should allow all forms of voluntary organization, and then let the market decide, provided that we don't have and then the government's role is to interfere where there is fraud, where there's theft, where there's violation of people's rights, that kind of that includes not honoring contracts or just straight up assault or abuse, and that their role, people will decide what is most valuable. And as soon as you decide, once you decide that the legislators are going to decide what you can buy and sell and under what conditions, that's when the legislators are the first things bought and sold. So we should minimize the degree of interference by the state, because then corporations can then take over, or unions can take over, or whatever.
I agree with that, maybe in principle, but I think in practice what happens is when we let the firms decide what sort of structure is going to exist, how they're going to structure themselves within our market system, what we find is that a system that has become dominant, quite frankly, I would argue, I think this is evident throughout history, is that these firms structure themselves in a way that maximizes the revenue funneled into the pockets of a very, very select few number of those who sit at the top of these firms, that they utilize these firms as a tool to maximize the amount of wealth they can create for themselves. And this is one of the major criticisms I would have with the capitalist system in general, is that I think that the way that the system is inherently structured, it will be utilized to maximize the profits and maximize the revenue that is then distributed to a select few number of those who own those very industries and markets without considering the needs of the workers below them.
I've got a request before we do go into Q&A. I do want to, forgive me, SOD. I know you had a round in the chamber ready to fire back. However, just to hear from Stephen and Stephen before we go into the Q&A shortly, in case you guys had anything. I know it's moving fast, and so oftentimes it's challenging to know when that time to jump in is. I want to give you a chance to mention anything you wanted to add.
Just really, really quickly, I'm going to run to the bathroom quick. I deeply apologize. I'll be right back.
I actually had a question, but I definitely want Steve to get another chance.
So the last time that I kind of chimed in, it was on the whole issue of taxes, and just to kind of just like very, very quickly kind of sum up, Bernie got a lot of kind of like, flack for saying this last year, but like I 100% agree with him. I don't think. I would just kind of expand on it a little bit. I don't think that billionaires should exist either. I don't think that billionaires should exist in the same country where people don't make enough money to survive, where somebody is working 40 hours a week and they are still coming up short on, money for food, for rent, for bills, whatever it is. I don't think that should be. I don't think that those two things should coexist within the same country. So I think that, taxing very, very wealthy people and like, look, the whole reason why he got a lot of flack for that is because but what that would mean is that somebody can have $999 million and still be incredibly rich and be like never probably be able to spend that money like ever. It's just going to get passed on to their children and their children's children. Taking some of that money and redirecting it back into, low-income neighborhoods, into states, into, pushing it into education, giving people access to healthcare. All of these things can be done by simply making it so that billionaires just don't exist. Maybe that's a little bit of a harsh kind of statement, and I know that there's going to be some people who are not going to agree with what I have just said, but I don't really think that that's too much of a.
I ask you what you just said.
Basically, just kind of expanding on the whole Bernie Sanders saying that billionaires shouldn't exist.
100%. There's no way you can earn $1 billion. It can't happen.
I get that. There's some people who is going to disagree with me, but I don't really think that that's too much of a fair compromise.
Can I ask a really, really quick question? A genuine question.
You want to hear just from Steve, as we hadn't heard from Steve from the capitalist side yet.
Sure.
I apologize.
Then I just go into Q&A. Go ahead, Steve.
I don't think that it's. I mean, I don't understand what the issue is there. I mean, specifically him, like Jeff Bezos, or I'm trying to think of another.
Elon Musk. Bill Gates.
That was actually the name I was trying to remember here. They don't get their wealth out of a vacuum. That money's coming to them in some form.
Yes.
I mean, what I hear a lot from the social side is that those individuals that make that kind of money have some kind of obligation to society. And I'm pretty sure that many of them do provide a lot of benefit to society just through their innovation, their profit, their employer, those that they employ. You look at Bill Gates and what he provides society, even though some of us don't agree with some of his ideas. What incentivizes someone to get to that point where you can even extract that amount of money from them? Where's the profit? I mean, if that profit doesn't exist, if you've already decided, well, you cannot make over this amount of money, what decision does he make at that point? It's like, well, if I make $34 million, they're going to just take it away from me anyways. Why would I even work that hard? Where's the incentive at that point?
I don't think that Jeff Bezos has an incentive to, or Elon Musk or Bill Gates really have an incentive to do anything anyway. I think that a majority of the innovation that flows out of these companies has absolutely nothing to do with the individuals who own them, like Bill Gates with Microsoft or Jeff Bezos with Amazon or Elon Musk with Tesla. I think that the innovation flows from the workers that they hire to work at their firms, and that those very people should be receiving the credit for the innovation, not the billionaires who hired them. That the wealth that these people generate is extracted from the labor provided by everyone that they hire to do their jobs. Most of these billionaires don't really do anything at all. Most of all of the administrative work that they would otherwise do, they pawn it off to other secretaries and administrators that they hire. They spend most of their time on their private jets and their yachts and their country clubs, golfing with all of their big rich billionaire buddies, doing nothing. Yet they make all of this money despite not really contributing anything to the firm that they own, while everyone below them contributes labor out of their day, time out of their day, time out of their life, time with their friends and their family, time building up who they are as a person, who they want to be, contributing labor to these firms that is then extracted out of them, extracted out of the labor that they provide, and captured by people simply because that person owns the business that they work at. I don't think that it's fair, and I don't think that it's an equitable system.
We want to, let's see, and give you
a
super short and pithy SOD response, and then we got to jump into the Q&A.
So try to address both. One, the whole billionaire shouldn't exist. The math doesn't really work out. You could take 100% of all billionaires' wealth in the U.S. It wouldn't fund the U.S. government for even a year, and then next year you wouldn't have any wealth to take anyway. It's very much balking at big numbers without context. Two, in the case of Amazon, 80% of Amazon's profits are through AWS, which is only 20,000 of its 810,000 employees. The rest of the consumer services are at razor thin margins as is. So this idea of redistribution, or they're not extracting, they're really taking a small amount from every single labor, and that's really it. The math doesn't work out where if you just make billionaires not exist, we can solve all of these problems. You're not really going to get that much wealth from them. And then once you take that wealth, if it's productive wealth, you won't be able to take it next year.
We can jump into the Q&A. Want to say thank you very much for your questions, folks. And we want to let you know that our guests are linked in the description. We appreciate our guests. And so we do thank you guys, and jumping into your questions, folks. We do appreciate all of them. This first one coming in from Secular Socialist says, Stephen, is there any Irish phrase you could teach the American audience?
We do have a lot of Irish phrases, but it would
we're
kind of
listening.
We have already used tick. So that's kind of something that is used to refer to a person who has, a very I don't know why I did that with my hands. It was anyway, but a very nice ass. But we already use tick as somebody who's stupid. So we don't really kind of use that. We have a grading system. We have taco, cheesy taco, and cheesy taco bacon. It's fantastic. I do think that Ireland has butchered the English language, in just how we use it. So there was a time in Irish history where we would look outwards at some other countries, and we called it the emergency. It was called the emergency, which every other country in the world called World War II. And the absolute pinnacle of this sort of just butchering of it, and I'll leave it at this, James, had we terrorism up north in the 70s, had we we'd a bit of trouble. It just makes no sense at all.
You got it.
I have a question for Cider about that. Is the Irish butchering of the English language, is that like a form of protest against the English?
That's a good question, Josh.
No,
That's a really good question.
I just sort of think that the Irish soul is just a much more of a free and a loose being, and there's too much rules in the English language. Like there's a wall of English language in between me and you, and fuck is my chisel. So that's
the English language is really just three kid languages in a trench coat. It's
Next up,
that's a good synopsis.
Appreciate your question. This one coming in from Secular Socialist Strikes Again, saying to Stephen and Leo, by this Stephen they mean Cider and Port and Leo, most leftists are socially left first. You consider yourselves to be quote unquote woke. Why or why not?
I don't know what is meant by the word woke.
Yeah,
just really quickly, the word woke I don't think actually has any. This is going to be, how do I word this? This is going to be a very unorthodox way of wording this, but I think that people will understand what I mean. The word woke has no meaningful meaning. If you can kind of understand what I mean by that. So I don't know what they mean. I don't know what they mean.
You got it.
I don't really consider myself to be that woke. Like I'm on the kind of side of like a lot of the woke standpoints and stuff like that. But like, really, I don't really consider myself to be that woke.
Juicy. And thank you very much for your question. This one coming in from Meduse NCO says, why is it that only individuals with nothing... Let me just pull this over. Okay, starting over. Why is it that only individuals with nothing want or believe in socialism? Successful people aren't interested. That would tell me something if I believed in socialism.
Well, there's been a number of very successful individuals that have advocated for socialism. Richard Wolff is a very successful individual. He's a Marxist. Noam Chomsky has expressed support for numerous Marxian ideas. People like Martin Luther King have advocated for socialism. Karl Marx was, I would argue, quite a successful individual who invented what socialism and communism, what Marxism, who the person it's named after, what these are. He defined them. It seems to me that it's getting at this point that, well, the only people that want socialism are those who think that they're privileged and they're entitled to all this. Well, you know what? People might disagree, but there are things that humans are entitled to by virtue of being a human, like healthcare, education, water, food, shelter. No human asks to be born. We shouldn't thereby have to really do anything to receive the things that are requisite to our survival. Those should be guarantees.
Juicy and Secular Socialist throws his or her hat into the ring once again, saying, Stephen, you said you've done stand-up on stream before. Do you think certain topics are off limits or shouldn't be joked about?
Oh my God, no. I have what a lot of people would kind of consider to be a dark sense of humor. I don't really consider my sense of humor to be that dark, but like I've joked about topics that like you probably shouldn't joke about. I think that like, you know, comedy can be like it's my coping mechanism. So if I go through grief, like on the day that my grandfather died, I was cracking jokes all fucking day. Like it's just like I understand that like sitting around a table and you know like being sad and feeling sorry for yourself, that can be some people's coping mechanism, and you're welcome to it, but it's just not for me. I don't think that this whole thing about like you know the like woke SJWs or anything else like this that they're like killing comedy. Nah, man, look at fucking Ricky Gervais, look at Daniel Sloss, look at like any of these like bigger comics that like are constantly talking about these things. Nah, man, comedy's not going anywhere.
I'm sorry, but it's the conservatives that have no sense of humor.
Bring it up. Since we're in the ballpark of the topic, allegedly, I had read an article that allegedly stated that socialism done left had apparently said some things and then claimed that they were a joke. Yeah. Is it okay to say the things that socialism done left had said as a joke?
See, it really depends, because what you'll find, and I know
really,
that.
really sorry, Leo. I'm kind of out of the loop here. I have no idea what we're referring to.
So socialism
Don't
done
say
left.
any of the words on this stream, Leo.
I won't, James. You know me. I'm not going to do that to you. I wouldn't do that to you. But socialism done left made several racist and other bigoted comments on Discord. There were screenshots, and they were from like several months ago, something like that. The thing is that he said that they were taken out of context and he wasn't meaning anything, and that he was mocking people that, actually believe those things. And honestly, when you look at the broader context of the discussion that was had on Discord, it seems that is the case. And that's why what I was going to initially say is that it's a bit nuanced. We often hear from people who make racist statements and this, that, and the other, that, oh, well, I was just joking. But what we need to understand is the broader context in which the joke applies. There are certain jokes that we can make that deal with race that are funny for reasons that people can pick up on and understand and know that it's a joke. Or you can make a joke about the race and the joke is racism. And that is drastically different than making a joke that concerns race that isn't about the racism. So whether or not one considers what SDL did okay or not, I think really depends on the framework at which they're looking at it. I would argue from a broader framework, it seems at least that these were jokes, albeit very, very ill-placed jokes, but jokes nonetheless.
What have you got, SOD? I think you're on mute.
No, I was just yawning.
Okay.
I did have one thing one topical thing to share regarding dark humor, if it's all right.
Yes.
All right, I'll share my screen real quick.
Uh-oh, here we go.
Oh.
Hold on one second.
I knew it was going to be good.
I'm squeezing it down 2 seconds. The audience can't see it yet, but I'm almost there to where they'll be able to see it.
Oh no!
I've just got to shrink it down because I was super zoomed in for the last screen share. 2 seconds. So sorry, folks. I'm curious if people in the chat are already guessing what it says, but let me. Oh god.
Depending on what circles you frequent, you've either you've definitely seen it a lot, or
for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, now they can finally see it in the audience because the screen share, I've adjusted it. So you're a very sick man. All right, next up, appreciate your going to the question from, is it pronounced Poopamans? Thank you very much for your question. Says Leo, if a company is collectively owned by the workers, wouldn't that make the workers shareholders? To me, it does, and I prefer it over right now. But it sounds like you believe the opposite.
It depends on whether or not there is a larger market that which shares of companies are traded upon. Most worker cooperatives that do exist or have existed don't have shares, just like the vast majority of companies that exist on the planet don't have shares and aren't traded on a market. The shares aren't traded on a market. I can't speak for any other countries, but in the United States of America, the stock market accounts for, and its value accounts for roughly 15% of the value of the US economy. When we speak of the stock market, we're not speaking of the communities or the companies that exist in the communities that you drive through. We're not speaking of middle America. We're not talking about, honestly, a large portion of the economy. We're talking about the largest firms within the industries that we operate within. And quite frankly, I don't think that measuring their success and their profitability, which is what the stock market, let's be honest, is a measure of, is their profitability, is really a measure of the overall success or productivity of the economy and the success of the people who participate within it.
Gotcha. And Baron Von G says, communist company, everyone makes the same salary. Why bother with the stress of running the company if you can push a broom and make the same salary?
Well, number one, the idea of a company wouldn't exist under. Well, the first thing I need to say is neither me nor Steve Insider Report are advocating for communism. At least I don't at the current instant. Number two, companies, the concept of a company wouldn't really exist, at least in the way that we understand it in communism. And number three, under communism, everybody doesn't earn the same thing. That essentially misses the point of what communism really is. I don't know if you have anything to add, Stephen.
No, I wouldn't have anything to add to that. Yeah, you kind of summed it up perfectly. Neither of us are advocating for communism, and that would, yeah. So.
Yeah, I think whoever posted that has a misunderstanding of what communism is. Communism is a classless society, but also a moneyless society. So his question is kind of incoherent to what communism would actually be.
Can I just thank you, Josh, in the fact that you properly understood what communism is? I appreciate that. I very much appreciate that.
You got it. And Bubblegum Gun says, most respectful debate I've seen so far. I agree. This has been really respectful. Yeah. So thank you guys. It has been a real treat. And Bubblegum Gun also says, government is a government is a necessity as much as theft is. But if you look empirically, government has created the most evil. Taxes are the seeds of authoritarians.
Oh, okay.
Is that wow. Specific to any particular person? I didn't quite hear that.
I don't think so, but I don't know.
Here's the issue so this is coming from like the libertarian aspect which I don't completely disagree with, but it definitely is taken too far. Where the idea is, okay, you cannot extend rights to someone else that you don't have yourself, and you don't have the right to take someone else's property by force. So you can't simply vote to take taxes, but you can organize voluntarily and then have a structure that is funded by taxation, but it depends on the manner of taxation and also the manner by which that taxation structure comes about. So governments can just be thieving scoundrels, but it's not inherent to government. You could argue it often is. And I think like excise taxes or sales taxes, which the government is providing the very structure of property ownership. So any exchange of property, I mean, I don't see how that's necessarily theft. But income taxes is a little meh. Wealth taxes, harder to say because the government isn't deciding the value of those things. But nonetheless, taxes aren't inherently theft, but many forms of taxes can manifest as a form of theft.
I just wanted to add really quickly because that the whole taxation is theft, and I do agree with the vast majority of what Josh just said. The whole I call them anti-taxers because the idea that taxation is theft, I would sum it up as just being asinine. We would not have the societies that we do in most of at least the Western world if it weren't for taxes. What taxes are, or at least what they're supposed to be, is a society collectively coming together and agreeing to pool a particular amount of their resources together to fund particular programs or incentives or what have you that generally benefit all of us together. And we see this in terms, maybe not here in the United States, but in many Western countries, we see this in the form of their healthcare systems, their education systems, numerous other public transportation, which is significantly more developed in a majority of the Western world outside of the United States, mainly because personal automobile ownership is a thing in the United States more so than others. But
it's the US
main
and Canada,
point is that,
but
yeah. The main point is that taxation is not theft. I agree with Josh that taxation, I think that there are ways that taxation can manifest itself as theft. And I think one of those is lowering taxes on the wealthy and increasing them on everybody else, requiring those who earn less to carry more of the tax burden. I don't think that's very fair. But I think that you can't have a technologically advanced society, the likes of which most Western countries enjoy, without the concept of taxation. And without taxation, most Western countries would not exist in the manner that they do today.
I would probably disagree on taking it that far. I mean, the U.S. had 2 industrial revolutions before we had an income tax, so it's certainly
true, yes.
And we mostly
there are reasons for that, though.
Well, the reasons were an income tax was unconstitutional until the 16th Amendment in 1913.
I don't know if it was really unconstitutional.
Well,
because it wasn't outlined in the Constitution that you can't do it. It was just made an aspect that.
Well, so more specifically, direct taxes have to be apportioned among
kind
the
of
states.
like ending slavery.
Well, so What I mean is that the kind of income taxes Congress wanted to pass, and what is common in Western countries, that would have been unconstitutional prior to the 16th Amendment because they weren't apportioned among the states. In that, okay, California has 12% of the population, 12% of the tax revenue from this tax has to come from California, regardless of how many people are in California, or regardless of the actual amount of income AGI in California. And Congress has already ruled that direct taxes outside of the income tax per the 16th Amendment they all have to be apportioned among the states, which includes property taxes, which then would extend to wealth taxes, which is why we can't have a national property tax. But Singapore is an interesting example because it has much lower taxes overall, but it has government ownership of certain industries, the dividends from which through Temasek Holdings provides revenue through almost a market mechanism to fund the government. So I don't. And I would definitely disagree that whether taxation is theft or not, does not depend on who is being taxed. Like, oh, it's unfair if the poor are being taxed and the rich aren't.
I do agree with that, and I just want to specify that is not what I was saying.
Okay.
I do agree with that sentiment.
I thought maybe you misspoken, but we probably don't have time for you. We could revisit that maybe later, like at another debate or something, because there's taxes. We could have a whole debate on taxes alone. So.
Bubblegum Gun strikes again, says, you will never have a capitalism under government if you pay property tax. Surprise, that's not ownership. We have a mixed economy, not capitalism.
So
I
the
assume that's
thing is,
to us, or I mean,
Not sure.
I don't know.
I'm
Well,
not
here's the
sure.
thing.
what
I would say this: given that the government defines and is at least right now the mechanism by which property is defended and defined, that the fact that they tax you on the thing that they're allowing as a legal phenomenon to exist doesn't mean that you don't own it. The purpose of ownership. A simple test of ownership is if you're able to exclude use by non-owners. The government does not have the right to just come on. Ideally, anyway, the government does not have the right to just come onto your property, to just come onto your property and do what they want with it. There's eminent domain, which is kind of BS, but nonetheless, there are definitely restrictions on the government regarding how they can use your property, and that's why you do own it. If the government, eminent domain is an example where they suddenly be like, yeah, you don't own it anymore, but whether you own something or not is not simply decided on you paying a tax for it. Is really my point.
James, could I have you repeat that question? I'm sorry, but I did want to respond. It's going to be really quick, but I can't remember exactly what the question
No worries.
was. If you want to move on, though, that's fine.
So what I remember it being is essentially because if your property is taxed, you don't own it. So then as long as the government is taxing your property, you don't have capitalism.
That's roughly.
So, the mixed economy thing. The idea of a mixed economy is, being honest, not really a thing in economics. There's no such thing as a mixed economy. That term is just very much nuanced, and that would be a whole ass discussion in and of itself. Capitalism is essentially defined as a private capital accumulation. That is one of the most, at least, succinct ways to define what capitalism is and what it entails. That capital can be accumulated privately by individuals privately. If you have that, you're capitalist. Even if that's regulated in certain ways, if capital accumulation is still private, that is capitalism. You might have strong social welfare alongside that. That's great. I would advocate for that, at least in principle. It would, depend on what particular systems are being implemented anyway. As long as the accumulation of capital in a market can be done privately, you are dealing with a capitalist system.
We'll jump into this next one from Con the Stoner Lynn, who says, anyone familiar with Pierre Joseph Proudhon or economic mutualism, the synthesis of property and communism? And what do you think of anarchism?
I have never heard of that person or that system, and as far as anarchism, I'm not necessally a proponent of it.
I think that's open to everybody to answer if they'd like.
So the problem with the issue with anarchism is you have the anarchist paradox, where if you it's important to remember that anarchy is just absence of rulers. It's not the absence of rules. But if you eliminate what you call the state, but you're going to need some means of defending and defining property, that if that becomes an accepted authority, they functionally, if not in name, and indeed become the state as well. So anarchy is arguably not something that's attainable, but there are minarchists who try to say that propose to have the least amount of government that's practicable.
Yeah,
As for me,
eventually. I was going to say, eventually, in an anarchist system, there's going to be organizations that grow just naturally, just as they did in human history.
I think that's true, but I think the point of anarchy is that they're not centralized systems, that they're very much communal, that the communities essentially govern themselves rather than there being a centralized form of control that governs all communities. Like, I think that the phrase that Josh SOD used is really good, that it's the elimination of rulers, not the elimination of rule. There are still going to be rules, and there are still probably going to be some sort of hierarchical system. I think that most anarchists would say that system is much more communal rather than being centralized and bureaucratic as we're used to, and that's what most anarchists would
Cider
would argue for.
If I can, because
really
Cider
quick,
might have,
and then we do have to. I want to give Cider a chance if he wants to. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that because Anarchist Ireland is actually an example of what Leo was saying, and maybe Cider has more insight on that.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say I have no idea who that person is. But anarchy, like, yeah, I don't like the whole idea of like, causing like massive systemic change through like a revolution and like even like a violent one. I mean, obviously, that's how the United States was kind of founded. It's how Ireland got its independence as well. I would, however, argue that we did it a little bit better. The only reason that I would say that is because in 1916 we fought the British, who had guns, with sticks. We brought sticks to a gunfight and we won. So just want to point that out.
Hey, Australia lost to not Kiwis, but cassowaries and ostriches. They lost to like a bunch of flightless birds. So I mean,
they lost to
Next up,
dinosaurs.
Con the Stoner Lynn strikes against us. What do you all think about intellectual property?
It should be protected. The one distinction I would make, the reason I would make it, yep, exactly, is that I wouldn't argue it's really intellectual property. It's the development of something like a vaccine or something along those lines. People can disagree. I'm sorry. I don't think that somebody has rights to that, but like a book or something along those lines, yes, I think it should be protected.
So this is the problem with intellectual property is that most of it is infinitely divisible. Like it's not actually a rivalrous commodity. It's like a club good, like a subscription to Netflix or a newspaper. Well, maybe not a newspaper, but like something like Netflix, where it actually is an infinite amount of it. And the problem really is that intellectual property laws go too far, where it's essentially admitting that I am afraid that my customers or competitors are going to make better use of this property than I will. If you're actually patents is fine, although I think the patent system needs to be reformed as well. But intellectual property is not an easy answer, I guess I should say.
You got it, Steve or Steve?
I'll just echo everything Leo said. So
I'm actually going to diverge a little bit from Joshua. I think property rights should be protected, or intellectual rights. Sorry.
I gotcha. You got it. Thank you. Interesting, gentlemen. And then Con the Stoner. Oh, that's right. The Legend Rivs. Thank you very much for your question. Was how does socialism stop inflation?
Same way capitalism does. I mean, I don't understand why.
Yeah, I mean that question. I don't, because there's
maybe he's just trying to state that maybe it's a better way to stifle or control
I don't
inflation?
know, because there's so many market factors that affect inflation that even under a market socialist system, it's not like, I mean, maybe somebody could make an argument that it would be maybe better or worse to handle inflation. I don't really know. I've never looked into that, but I would argue from my limited knowledge that the market forces as they operate under a market socialist system would probably control inflation in at least similar ways as we have now.
Gotcha. And Khan, the Stoner Lynn said, let's see. Socialists remember Robert Owen, a wealthy industrialist who gave everything to build socialism twice. New Lanark and New Harmony, Indiana.
What? No, I don't know that name.
I actually
Robert
saw that name
Owen?
during my research, but I didn't look into it too deeply.
Juicy. Secular Socialist says, James asked Stephen to tell us a joke now.
Jesus Christ, just poking me with a stick, just dance, monkey dance. Gee, it put me on the fucking spot. Oh god, a quick one. What does a Make-A-Wish child and a carton of milk have in common? An expiration date. Sorry, I didn't say my sense of humor was dark.
That's dark humor.
Jumping to the next one, Bubblegum Gun says, private tanks protects property. I don't need government stealing my property to protect it from being robbed. That's an oxymoron. Second Amendment.
What?
Is that a
I mean,
question?
Yeah, I don't know what are you.
I think what he's
I
trying
think
to say is that,
yeah.
that because he's able to defend his own property with rights with that which is afforded by the Second Amendment, that he doesn't need the government to do so, and then the government therefore does not have a legitimate claim over much, if not all, taxation that it does. I think that's what he's saying. I'm not sure.
I mean, that's an interesting argument.
There's only so much limit that an individual has control over a certain piece of property, though. I mean, yeah, you could say, well, I've got a tank myself, but there's going to be someone out there with two tanks. I mean, it's just. Unfortunately, you can, unless you've got your own nuclear arsenal, there's other areas in the world that are going to be able to take your property from you, regardless of what your Second Amendment rights are. And I never promoted the Second Amendment as well. So,
well, I mean, Vietnam shows that you don't need a nuclear arsenal to defend yourself.
It's very much true.
History, guerrilla warfare. So the issue with war is that if you don't have you need the political will to prosecute a war as well as the material. And guerrilla warfare can create a lot of casualties very quickly, and all those soldiers coming back is going to kill political will, and that's why the Viet Cong basically won. So I mean, history was replete with guerrilla warfare working against technologically, numerically superior foes, and including the Revolutionary War for the U.S.
Yes, exactly.
Gotcha. And this
That's how
one,
we beat the British.
D Mac, appreciate it, said, can an observation be fallacious?
Can an observation be fallacious? It's an interesting question.
It feels like so an argument can be fallacious because it comes with a conclusion.
Yeah, what I was going to say is that I don't think an observation could be fallacious because an observation is not itself an argument. An observation would be represented by an argument. The argument can be fallacious, but the observation itself, I don't think fallaciousness would apply to that.
No, I do agree. An observation is at most a premise for an argument. It doesn't.
Yeah.
So I mean,
yeah.
you can have observations that are wrong because either
hallucinations, things like that. Yeah.
Delusions, or maybe your sensors don't have enough. Either your actual sensors or like your transmitters don't have enough fidelity. There's all sorts of reasons where you get incorrect information, but that's not the same thing as being fallacious.
Yeah.
You got it. And Displace Gamer, thanks for your question. Last one we have here says, my question, market socialism is just another form of capitalism. It is still private ownership working within a market. Would a better name be social capitalism?
No, because it isn't private ownership. The firms in a market socialist economy would be collectively owned and democratically controlled by the working class, which is the signifying attribute of socialism.
I think what he's trying to say is that it's one thing to say that the workers at that firm are the owners. It's another thing to entirely say the working class all own that firm and that firm. They all. So I think that's what he's saying is that only the workers at that firm own that firm, as opposed to all the workers own all of the firms. So I think that because in that case, the workers who own that firm, they are the exclusive owners of that firm. And in a sense, they are a collectively private organization. I think that's what his argument is.
DMAC
It
responds.
just doesn't strike me as capitalism.
DMAC says, thanks. You're welcome, DMAC, and thank you. And we want to let you know, folks, our guests are linked in the description, as it says here on the right side of your screen. Highly encourage you to check them out, as we do appreciate our guests. And that includes if you're listening via podcast. Folks, if you have not already, pull up your favorite podcast app, such as these right here on screen. Look up Modern Day Debate and subscribe for listening to these debates via podcast. And if you're listening via podcast, I want to let you know all of our guest links are in the description box there, as well, as we really do want to say thank you to our guests. We appreciate them. And with that, gentlemen, it's been a true pleasure. We really do appreciate you. Thanks for being with us tonight.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, James.
It's been a real
My
treat.
pleasure.
Thanks for having me.
Oh yeah, this has been great.
Absolutely. Really respectful. I really do. People really enjoyed it. And folks, I will be back with a really short post-credit scene in just a moment, letting you know about upcoming debates. So stick around for that, and I'll be right back.
Yeah. I'm not dying. Get out of here.
Folks, that was epic. Really excited to be with you. Want to quick say hello, and then I want to let you know. First, I just want to say hi to you in chat and let you know we appreciate you. Davos Holdos, thanks for being with us. Says, I got you on Spotify now. Oh, that's really cool. We're so glad. I'm pumped that the podcast people have been finding it useful. So that's encouraging. And so thank you. Glad that I hope it's useful to you and fun. And so I'm huge on podcasts. I love podcasts. I even sometimes will download Modern Day Debate because sometimes my attention is split. Long story short, it's nice to get to listen to it after. And so also want to say hello, Leo TJ says, everyone go like. Thank you for your support, Leo. Seriously. And Norman Bates says, James looks like Bert from Bert and Ernie. That's funny. Thank you very much, Norman. Glad you're here. Fox Sushi, good to see you. Brooke Chavez says, tickle that like button. Indeed. And thank you for your support. Patrick Benek, glad you were here. And yeah, thanks. Sorry about that. I am behind on the links. So I have to update Stevens. I forgot. And then I also have to add the capitalist guest links. Sorry about that. They just hadn't given them to me prior. So I will get those updated, and I appreciate you letting me know about that. And Riley S., good to see you. Thanks for your support of the channel. Hannah Anderson, good to see you as well. And let's see, Mark Reed, glad you're here. And Brian Griffin, good to see you. Louis Preciado, glad you made it. Says, beta male here. Hi. Thanks for coming by. And Displaced Gamer, good to see you. And said, I've been watching for a while but never asked a question. Then glad you got my question in. My pleasure, Displaced Gamer. Thanks for coming by. And then Vera said, just subscribe to podcast. Great for driving. Oh, I'm so glad to hear that, Vera. That's encouraging. And I couldn't agree more. That's one nice thing about the podcast is that basically, what is it? Long form content. You don't have to click down on your phone to change it because then it's like a 2-hour debate. So I've had people that are like, yeah, I listen to the Modern Day Debate podcast while I'm just like cooking, while I'm cleaning, while I'm, someone said that while they were working out, a good workout, both for your mind and your body. And so Evil Atheist Despot says, what other podcast do you listen to if you don't mind answering? Happy to. I actually kind of have like a spattering. So one of them is on, I'm trying to learn about real estate stuff, which just I find interesting, and I'm like looking forward to someday wanting to buy a house. And so I'm trying to learn about it little by little, but also I do love Freakonomics. That's one that I've always loved for a long time. I do enjoy, and it's been a long time since I found it, and that since I've enjoyed it for a while now. Unbelievable with Justin Brierly, so they have a lot of debates on religion. That's a fun one. And then, but yeah, so I would say a good mix. And Riley S says, I'm glad to then. Glad you are. And Brian Griffin says, hey, James, where did you get the World Goes Wild song from? Man, you'd have to Google it. If you Google it and just type in by Above Envy, that's the name of the artist, Above Envy, and you can find it. Basically, I just got it, it was like a $10 licensure to get the rights to use the song on YouTube. And yeah, it's never been hit with copyright infringement, which is really nice because a lot of stuff, sometimes I buy stuff on Fiverr, like those channel intros we used to do, and they'd get hit with copyright infringement. So anyway, let's see. We don't actually have it's not A. Jones who we are talking to for the potential next big event. We are actually talking to, well, I can't say the names because surprisingly, and honestly, I'm being patient. We have this epic event because I don't know, folks, if you didn't know, we do a Kickstarter event once in a while where we try to raise funds for kind of like a generous honorarium for each of our guests. And it's usually like a higher level debate, so bigger name people. And what happened is I'm still waiting on the debaters, in particular one, to confirm it. And so frankly, I'm being very patient because the person, it's been weeks, and I told him, I said, if I don't hear back by Friday, I'm going to have to find somebody else. So, but yeah, Mark Taylor, thanks for coming by. Says, how does one become a debater on this channel? If you email me at moderndaydebate@gmail.com, I can let you know. We do have like things that we usually ask for. One would be we obviously like to see if a person has debate experience. That helps. John House says, Bigger Pockets real estate channel. Oh, it's like Bigger Pockets because Bigger Pockets. So yeah, I have listened to Bigger Pockets before, but it's like it's a smaller one up in the northern Colorado area. So Bigger Pockets, by the way, is their headquarters are in Denver, even though one of the more popular people, he lives out in like Hawaii and stuff. But anyway, this one's like a northern Colorado, so it's pretty similar to it. But long story short, John House says, more Kent Hovind, please, LOL. That's not going to be, he won't be, we do plan on hosting him again, but it won't be for that particular event. But Riley S says, Silly James, that was me replying to someone in chat. Oh, gotcha. Thanks for letting me know. And I want to say hi to everybody in the old Twitch chat. Good to see you, Brooke Sparrow and Topatzel, as well as Kai Reason. Good to see you. Thanks for hanging out with us. And Ozian, are you still in here? There you are. And last username, good to see you. Thanks for being with us. Poor Lucy. And yes, we are excited that Twitch, it's always fun, pumped that people are enjoying the Twitch chat. And yes, we are excited. So let me tell you about the future in particular. So glad to hear that. Brian Griffin says, thanks, James. I'm really loving the intro song. Oh, I'm so glad to hear that. I love it too. I enjoy it. And let me show you. This next week, we will have, it's supposed to be next week. It might be a little bit later out. We're confirming this Bigfoot debate, which will be a 2-on-2. This Friday, we are supposed to have Wotan and MC Toon debating Flat Earth. So that should be fun. That is still up in the air. I'm still waiting on Wotan to confirm. It's been a long week. But I'm also excited that this Saturday should be a fun one. It'll be a tag team on whether or not Noah's Ark has already been found. So we do host, if you're new here, want to let you know Modern Day Debate is a neutral channel. So we only host debates. We don't have any sort of video that are like arguing on behalf of any particular view. We literally only host debates. And, maybe like an occasional thank you video where we say thanks everybody for your support. When we do appreciate your support, folks. Want to let you know. We are a neutral platform hosting debates on science, religion, and politics. We want to let you know, no matter what walk of life you are from, folks, socialist, capitalist, Christian, atheist, Republican, Democrat, you name it. We hope you feel welcome. We really are glad that you are here with us, and it makes it fun. It's the more the merrier, folks. You've got a good melting pot here of people from different ideas and perspectives and backgrounds, and we like that. And so Mark Taylor says, thanks, James. Thank you, Mark, for your kind words. Now, I've got to go in just a bit, so I wish I could stay longer, and I'm excited to see you on Friday. That's going to be epic. But I actually am like in a little bit of a time crunch, so I've got to run. But thank you all for your support. Thank you so much, for real. Love you guys. You guys always make it fun. It's honestly a blast, and so we really do appreciate you. So we hope to see you at upcoming debates. And so if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and that notification bell as well for many more upcoming debates, as we are excited for those, and it'll be a blast. So thanks, everybody, and we appreciate you hanging out here. Keep sifting out the reasonable from the unreasonable.